back, ladies and gentlemen. So, we're continuing to talk about interactions that occur in communities, right? So, between different species. And very much so, much of that interaction is driven by feeding relationships, right? So, when we talk about feeding relationships, really we can take all of the living things that exist in an ecosystem, and for the most part, we can throw them into two categories. Are they producers or are they consumers? So, are they capable of producing their own energy from non living sources, from the sun, from other chemicals, that kind of thing? And that energy then is provided not only to themselves, but then ultimately to anything that would eat them. These are your autotrophs. So, things like plants are usually the first thing that kids think about when we talk about producers. Your consumers then are organisms that need to eat other organisms, whether it's plants or other animals, in order to obtain the energy that their body will then convert into energy that the cells can actually use. And these guys are your heterotrophs. So things like our cute little rabbit or our lion here, those guys are your consumers or your heterotrophs. So producers are capable of trapping energy, again, either from the sun or from some other inorganic chemical source. And so when we look at processes that are going on at the cellular level in these producers in order to produce that energy that they need, it usually happens in one of two processes. We either talk about photosynthesis, things like plants and algae and some bacteria that are capable of taking energy from the sun and converting it into chemical energy, usually in the form of sugars. And then their body will take those sugars and use that to convert it into molecules like ATP, which the cells can then use to do all sorts of other chemical cellular work, pumping things across their cell membrane, moving organelles around, so on and so forth. Chemosynthesis is another process that producers or autotrophs could use in order to produce their own energy. Here, they're going to make sugars or some other carbohydrate derivatives from chemicals that they are using as an energy source. And chemosynthetic organisms, more often than not, are bacterial. And those chemosynthetic organisms tend to exist in some really extreme environments. So, places like deep in the oceans at hydrothermal vents where there is no sun. So clearly using photosynthesis in that option or in that location, I should say, is not an option. There is no sunlight, or in places like hot springs and other very harsh environments where, although the sun might be accessible, they have evolved to use the chemosynthesis instead. Um, these guys, when we talk about food chains, typically are at the bottom of the food chain, and often in terms of overall number of individuals in an ecosystem, these guys tend to have the highest, what we'll talk about as biomass, or just a sheerly larger number of individuals in the environment, because they're going to end up feeding the rest of that food chain. Your consumers, then, these guys are the ones that are going to ingest food from some other source, and that food then somewhere along the food chain contained the energy or converted the energy from the sun, or in the case of chemosynthesis from chemicals, into cellular energy. These guys then are eating somewhere up that food chain. So we talk about consumers also as heterotrophs, right? Hetero meaning different. They have to eat other things. They can't automatically make the food themselves like an autotroph could. And so consumers tend to fall then within one of four categories, depending on what the food source is that they consume. So your herbivores, these guys are organisms that are strictly plant eaters. These guys are often primary consumers on the food chain. So they will be sort of just that next level up from a producer or an autotroph. And they're very often prey species. So our cow here, he is a herbivore eating grasses and plants like that. And then if this were not a domesticated cow, like we're seeing here in the picture, other organisms, predators would come in and tend to eat these guys. Your carnivores, then, these tend to be strictly predators. They are probably many times often high order, what we talk about as high order predators. They are pretty high up the food chain oftentimes, and these guys are strictly meat eaters. So they will hunt those prey animals for food. They will convert the energy that the herbivore or that prey species took from wherever it ate something, and we drive that all the way back down the food chain to eventually those herbivores who are eating those plants and taking the energy that the plants self-made by either photosynthesis or chemosynthesis, and work that up the food chain. Another type of carnivore, we can get a little bit more specific, are these things called scavengers. If you've ever seen a turkey vulture, that's a pretty classic example of a scavenger. That's what these guys are here. They are eating the sort of leftover carrion from a primary kill. I believe that's probably a zebra there that a lion came in and killed. And then these guys are going to kind of finish off whatever meat was left behind. Detritivores could also kind of fall into here, although that's just another word that we can see for those scavengers. Omnivores are organisms like us, right? Omni means many, so we can eat both plants and animals. So when we talk about food chains, in reality, the actual feeding relationships of organisms in an ecosystem oftentimes is much more of a web-like structure as opposed to just one link to the next, because a lot of organisms fall within this omnivore category where they will eat both plants and animals, or will at very least eat multiple animals on the food chain. And so we're not necessarily just going from one link to the next. Instead, we're eating multiple things. And so there's multiple connections to each organism in the way that it takes in energy and then passes that energy off to the next level. Decomposers, then, these guys are going to be organisms like the fungi, and a lot of bacteria also fall into the decomposer category, where they will take complex compounds of dead and decaying plants and animals, what you may know as detritus, and break them back down into similar molecules that they then absorb, use, and then will also help play a major role in recycling material in an ecosystem so that we can take it from that sort of top predator who has worked energy through the food chain and return it back to the bottom of that food chain, more the nutrients than the energy per se. But recycling carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus and all of those elements that are necessary to make all those macromolecules in living things, these guys help to recycle all of that, and get it back to the bottom of the food chain so it can work its way back up again. So when we look at feeding relationships in ecosystems, we can talk about a specialist versus a generalist and sort of benefits to each of these categories. So a specialist, these guys are organisms somewhere along that food chain that will consume a very specific or very special diet of either just one single organism or a very small variety of it. A generalist, on the other hand, will consume organisms from a much wider varying diet, whether they are omnivores who will eat plants and animals, or just a carnivore that would eat multiple species for their meat. Clearly, those specialists are going to be organisms that have a much harder time dealing with environmental fluctuation, and are often the first ones to end up on something like an endangered species list due to habitat destruction or other natural disasters. So being a specialist, if we were to look at a food chain, they would typically only have one arrow coming from them, but a generalist may make more of that web and have multiple connections to species underneath them. Clearly, that generalist is going to have an evolutionary advantage in an ecosystem that is constantly fluctuating, um, as well as just having more variety to pick from. So why do specialists exist? Well, it's often that they fit into a very specific niche in their ecosystem, and the ecosystem has more or less been relatively stable for most of their evolutionary history, and so they've been able to get away with it. Something to keep in mind. as we're talking about these feeding relationships is that matter is going to cycle, right? So we'll get to these things called biogeochemical cycles. How do I move carbon around? How do I move phosphorus around? How do I move sulfur around? Nitrogen around? When we talk about moving things through different organisms in an ecosystem, I can get to the top and recycle it back to the bottom. Energy, on the other hand, I can't create or destroy it. That is a construct of physics. And so energy is going to get used. It can only flow in a single direction. And eventually we have converted it so many times that it ends up in a form that we can't use any longer. And there's no way to change that sort of lost energy back into forms that organisms can recycle. Matter, luckily, although we can't create or destroy matter either, is much more flexible in that ability to recycle it. So when we look at the direction of food chains, we're going to see that energy is always going to flow in a single direction. It's going to flow from your producers all the way to the top predators. And we can change its forms along the way, but I can't take it from that top predator and recycle it back down to those producers like I'm going to be able to do when we start talking about those nutrient cycles. So all organisms require energy to survive. You need that ATP in order to move, to grow, to reproduce, to continually do your metabolism, which means we have to constantly be feeding energy into our ecosystems. The only way that happens is by either photosynthesis or chemosynthesis. So organisms who are capable of taking inorganic sources of energy and converting them into organic forms. So chemosynthesis, this is going to happen, just to take a brief look at it, in organisms that are able to form sugars from inorganic sources, but they'll do this without the power of light. So they'll take things like the carbon dioxide, water, hydrogen sulfide that might be coming out of hydrothermal vents, the oxygen that's there, and convert that into a simple carbon-based molecule, which then can get converted into other forms of sugars that they can use themselves, but also can be taken in by primary consumers and move up the food chain as well. So again, these guys are typically producers. They're typically bacteria, and we find them in some really interesting places. So things like sulfur-rich salt marshes, so kind of stinky, not something that is generally thought of as hospitable, but these guys really make that ecosystem flourish as a result. Hydrothermal pools, this is Grand Prismatic in Yellowstone. Super, super toasty. In fact, the coloration that you're seeing here is not only due to temperature, but as a result of the bacteria that live there. So the guys who can really handle super, super hot temperatures live here in the middle, and then each of these color gradients is a different temperature range as well as different bacteria that are capable of living in that temperature range. So it's a really cool, interesting location. And then around those deep sea vents, those hydrothermal vents, and this is really the major producer that is supporting that entire ecosystem living in that total darkness, which is really cool to even think about that this could exist. But the only reason it does is because chemosynthesis is a process that is incredibly old. We do believe that this particular autotrophic process is probably the oldest of the two, simply because we think that the environmental conditions around these hydrothermal vents would be much more similar to the conditions we think early Earth would have looked like.
The Pacific Ocean, 250 miles off the coast of the Galapagos Islands. In 1977, a deep-sea submarine descended over 8,000 feet. Its mission? To investigate hydrothermal activity on the ocean floor. Marine explorer Robert Ballard was aboard. He detected a dramatic change in the ocean's temperature.
You know, we were not expecting what we found. We were expecting to find water, and we had a camera inside the vehicle, but it was just taking pictures, so we didn't know what we had till we came back. And we brought it up to the surface, and we processed the film, and we knew the spot where the temperature spike was, and it was like going to Disneyland. Probably one of the biggest biological discoveries ever made on Earth was made that day.
Bauer and his team were the first to see it, face to face. Hydrothermal vents. Immense chimney-like structures, several stories high, spewing hot water geysers, black with minerals and nutrients. The temperature around these deep-sea vents was a scorching 760 degrees Fahrenheit. And then an astonishing sight. Life, thriving without sunlight, a biological community never seen before. An exotic garden of marine life. Species without eyes. Others resembling Triassic-era fossils, over 200 million years old.
What we totally were blown away by were these giant tube worms. Some of them 8, 9, 10 feet tall. And when you cut them, they bled human-like blood. I mean, when the submarine landed, there was a squish, and red blood came up around all the portholes. And that's how eerie it was. And then to find these extremely unusual creatures living in this oasis. It had no relationship to the normal life of the deep sea. And yet here they were living in this toxic water. But yet these creatures were thriving on it. And then when we dissected, I remember we took one of these clams, and we opened it up in the first place. Whew, as soon as we opened it up, it stunk.
It was full of hydrogen sulfur.
Horrible smell.
Rotten eggs.
Yeah. And we opened it up, and then we looked, and it didn't look. It looked like beef. It was red, bright red, and it didn't have an anatomy of a clam. It was like, what happened to the clam? Someone had taken over its body, and that something was a bacterium, a tiny bacterium that had figured out over eons of time how to duplicate photosynthesis in the dark chemically through a process we now call chemosynthesis. And that was the discovery, that there was another life system on Earth that did not go by the book that you and I read, that was not living off the energy of the sun, but was living off the energy of the Earth itself. And that really opens up the ballgame.
I'll say.
And these bacterium, we now think are the largest mass of living things on Earth.
That they're in the rocks, everywhere.
In the whole mountain range.
Under the ocean.
If you added up all the people and all the living things on land and add up all the creatures in the ocean and the few things in the sky, and you got a number, so many tons, there's more tons of biomass. We used to just think, you know, the insects rule the earth.
Yeah.
Wrong. These bacterium.
So where are these vents?
All over the Earth. Imagine a baseball with a seam on it. That seam begins beneath the polar ice caps, goes down through the Atlantic, into the Indian Ocean, across the Pacific. It runs around the Earth for 42,000 miles. It's the largest feature on Earth, the mid-ocean ridge, and it's underlain by literally tens of thousands of magma chambers.
Is that where life began, in the hot springs?
Well, that's what people are now thinking. The biology books that we were reading have now been thrown away.
Yeah.
And they're
when I
writing
grew
new
up,
ones.
everything, you had to be on the surface.
That's right. And you had this soup and the lightning bolt hit it and you formed all sorts of amino acids and things like that. But now what we think is that the hydrothermal vents may have been the site of life on Earth. It's also given us a new prospecting tool for searching for it elsewhere with our own solar system. We're now looking at a moon of Jupiter called Europa, which we think has an ocean. We think it has underwater volcanoes, and there should be life down there. The question is, how smart are their clams?
Did hydrothermal vents give birth to the first primitive microbes on Earth? Perhaps. But one thing is certain. Their discovery challenged long-held beliefs about the conditions necessary for creating life. And once life happened, there was no stopping it.
And then we can quickly review photosynthesis as another option for producing energy in an ecosystem. So taking light energy from the sun, turning it into that stored chemical energy in the form of that molecule called G3P. Hopefully that sounds familiar. That sugar precursor. And then we can convert that into all sorts of other organic molecules that your organisms need. So the sun really is the ultimate source of energy for most organisms, surface level organisms, where they'll take those carbohydrates then, and either the plants themselves or the organisms that eat those plants then do that process of cellular respiration, taking those carbohydrates, going through processes like glycolysis and your Krebs cycle and your oxidative phosphorylation to end up turning that chemical energy into ATP. And that ATP then can be used by the cells to do all sorts of other cellular work, moving things around, so on and so forth. Keep in mind, though, that the process of photosynthesis, while that is very much tied directly to those autotrophs, cellular respiration still exists and still works in those autotrophs as well. They are making that chemical energy from the sunlight for themselves. Organisms that happen to eat those plants just happen to benefit from that stored carbohydrate that the plant hasn't been able to use yet.